I'm Catherine Hellerstein. I'm the Ruth Meltzer Director of the Jewish Studies program at Penn, and I'm a professor of Yiddish in the Department of Francophone, Italian, and Germanic Studies. On behalf of the University of Pennsylvania and the faculty of the Jewish Studies program and of my department, I am delighted to welcome you to the 37th Annual Joseph Alexander Colloquium. The Joseph Alexander Colloquium is the Jewish Studies program's oldest endowed lectureship. Over the past 37 years, it's become one of our real institutions, an intellectual touchstone and highlight of the Penn Jewish Studies academic year. Thankfully, this year, we're able to convene in person, which we haven't for the past 2, 3, multiple years. And I'm really happy that those of you who are here in person. And I know there are others out there in Zoom land, and I welcome you as well. The Alexander Colloquium was established through the generosity of the Joseph Alexander Foundation and the Mackler family, specifically by Helen and Alfred Mackler of blessed memory, in memory of their late brother and Uncle Joseph Alexander. The Macklers are longstanding loyal friends of the University of Pennsylvania, and they've been among the staunchest supporters of the Jewish Studies program here since its inception. And I'm especially happy to be able to welcome on this Zoom call Harvey Mackler, Randy Mackler Windheim, and I'm moving, I hope I'm not out of sight now, and Noah Snyder Mackler. All of us at in the Jewish Studies program are very appreciative of the opportunities that the Mackler family has given us to join together to explore issues and share ideas on important Jewish topics within a scholarly forum for the benefit of the faculty and students of the University of Community and of the larger Philadelphia community. Additional support comes from Jewish Studies and from Germanic Studies, which is now part of the Department of Francophone, Italian, and Germanic Studies. Because we are doubling this event, we're making it also stand in for the annual Kristallnacht commemoration that the Jewish Studies program and Germanic Studies, which used to be Germanic Languages and Literature, has sponsored for many years. And we are also grateful for support from the Department of Russian and East European Studies and from the Department of History here at Penn. This year marks the 84th anniversary of Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, which will take place, I guess, yes, tomorrow, November 9th, 2022. I want to thank Chrissy Walsh, the administrative coordinator for the Jewish Studies program, who is managing the Zoom option for this event, and she's also made all the arrangements for all of us who are here in the flesh. We couldn't make this happen without Chrissy. And I also want to welcome the students of modern Jewish history in a course being taught at Penn in the History Department and Jewish Studies by Professor Beth Wenger. So I'm really glad that you're here as well. Over the past 3.5 decades, the Joseph Alexander Colloquium has brought many distinguished speakers to Penn, including political scientists, scholars of Yiddish and of Hebrew literature and culture, medieval and modern Jewish scholars, historians, ethnomusicologists, a prize-winning culinary scholar, and many others. The speakers tonight are 3, and I'm going to introduce them very briefly. And there's a handout that I hope everybody has a copy of, at least in the flesh, which tells you much more about the 3 speakers. First will come Elissa Bemporad. She's professor of history and the Ungar chair in East European Jewish history and the Holocaust at Queens College and the CUNY Graduate Center. She's author of many books, including Becoming Soviet Jews, The Bolshevik Experiment in Minsk, The Legacy of Blood, Jews, Pogroms, and Ritual Murder in the Lands of Soviets, and Revolution, Civil War, and New Ways of Life, Forthcoming with and New York University Press. And she writes that she's currently working on a biography of Ester Frumkin. The second speaker will be Amelia Glaser. She is professor of literature at the University of California, San Diego, where she holds the endowed chair in Judaic studies. And she's the author of Jews and Ukrainians in Russia's Literary Borderlands and Songs in Dark Times, Yiddish Poetry of Struggle from Scottsboro to Palestine. She's also an amazing translator from Yiddish of poetry and other things from Yiddish, Ukrainian, and Russian. And she's currently writing about contemporary Ukrainian poetry. And our final speaker is Jeffrey Veidlinger. He's the Joseph Brodsky Collegiate Professor of History and Judaic Studies at the University of Michigan. He's the author of award-winning books, such as In the Midst of Civilized Europe, the 1918 to 1921 pogroms in Ukraine, and the onset of the Holocaust, and also In the Shadow of the Shtetl, Small-Town Jewish Life in Soviet Ukraine, and many other works as well. And he's currently writing a book on the Galveston movement and early 20th century plan to resettle Russian and Ukrainian Jews in the Great Plains of the United States. And let me explain briefly the format. Each panelist will speak for about 20 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A amongst them and also amongst you with the audience. For those of you who are on Zoom, please post any questions or comments in the Q&A function on the webinar. Chrissy Walsh will select from them, and I will do my best to read them out loud. We'll figure out how to do this. So meanwhile, please welcome our speakers, Professors Elissa, Bemporad, Amelia Glaser, and Jeffrey Veidlinger.
Okay. Okay. Good evening, everyone. It's so good to be here in person. Thank you so much, Catherine, for this generous introduction. Thank you all for being here. Thank you, Chrissy, for being, so helpful with everything. Okay, so let me begin by stating the obvious. That it would be very wrong for us to superimpose a teleology of violence on the long and rich history of Jewish life on the territory of what is today Ukraine. A history that generated a unique diversity of religious, political, and cultural contributions to Jewish history, and that was marked significantly more by coexistence between Jews and non-Jews than it was by violence. I'm saying this not only in response to the genocidal war that Russia has launched against Ukraine, justifying it, among other things, by manipulating the past and demonizing Ukrainians as quintessentially violent, but also as a reminder to resist this teleological view of the Jewish experience in the region as if Jews were doomed from the very beginning, enveloped in perpetual violence. Now, that being said, I will be talking about violence today, hopefully without falling into this teleology of violence. And I'd like to talk about the violence of the Russian Civil War, the epicenter of which was Ukraine from 1918 until 1921. And I will do so by focusing First, I'll give you some context, and then I will focus on the voice and work of one chronicler of this violence, Rachel Rojo Feigenberg. And after that, I will discuss a little bit, I will offer some thoughts about what happened to the memory of this violence, and then conclude with some thoughts about contemporary Ukraine. Now, before I introduce Feigenberg, let me just go over very quickly the nuts and bolts of the nuts and bolts of the events in Ukraine in 1918, 1921. So we are in the wake of World War I, shortly after the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. You have a violent war that erupts in the eastern territories of the European continent, in present-day Ukraine, but also in Belarus, in southern Russia, between different armies and forces representing opposing geopolitical goals. You have the Ukrainian army, armed forces that are fighting against the Red Army, attempting to retain the independence of the Ukrainian People's Republic, which was established in December 1917. You have the Red Army that is waging a war for the victory of Bolshevism, vying to control the territory of the former Tsarist Empire, which also includes Ukraine. And then you have, the white movement that is the white troops that are fighting for a return of autocracy to the lands of the Russian Empire. So they're also fighting against the Red Army. And then you have the Polish troops fighting on behalf of the recently established Second Polish Republic against the Red Army. In addition to the military forces involved, you have a diverse group of anarchist peasant bands and thousands of civilians who join the fighting, often swayed more by the desperate socioeconomic conditions of war, famine, and the region, after all, has been at war since 1914, rather than swayed by political allegiances. Most troops and military units involved in the conflict perpetrated atrocities against the Jewish population. Here you have some quotes by some survivors. The pogroms became unprecedented, both in nature and scale. They were military pogroms, but we also witnessed a significant participation on the part of the neighbors, as war, famine, shortage of food led neighbors to turn against neighbors and participate in looting and even killing Jews. So you have approximately 1,500 pogroms carried out in approximately 800 towns and shtetl, most of them located in Ukraine. As many as 150,000 Jews died as a result of this violence. The motivation, I won't get into the details of the motivation, but the motivation vastly differed. You have desperate conditions of war that encourage soldiers and local peasants to loot the Jewish communities. You have, let me see here. You have political military leaders on all sides that identify the Jews as disloyal towards the Ukrainian dream of nationhood, but also towards the Polish reestablished nation state, or towards the Russian vision of a revitalized empire. And this intersects with an exclusivist nationalism that peaks during World War I, and of course with the fear of Bolshevism. So Jews are imagined as interlopers in the national body and imagined as forces connected to Bolshevism, tearing at the heart of the nation's fabric. Now, Ukraine becomes the main stage of the battlefront. Anti-Jewish violence had disrupted the lives of Jews living in cities and towns of Ukraine time and again since the 17th century. The violence generally occurred on the backdrop of political upheaval and socioeconomic tensions and was reinforced by pre-existing class tensions and religious stereotypes, but it often found its main source in the divergence between Jewish and Ukrainian political strategies and goals. Jews, as a minority everywhere, could not create their own army. They needed protection and sought it from existing power, the monarch, the nobility, forging what Yerushalmi called the royal alliance, siding with the highest authority, which promised protection, became the Jewish community's survival strategy. But this alliance between Jews and the centers of power was every so often at odds with Ukrainians' political goals. Ukrainians created armies and fought for independence. The lack of common political goals fostered horizontal tensions and clashes between Jews and their neighbors, yielding some tragic consequences. For example, the 1648 Cossack uprising against Polish rule. In Ukraine, Bohdan Khmelnytsky's forces carried out anti-Jewish massacres, primarily because they identified Jews as allies of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. The same political dynamic, more than 100 years later, was at play during the 1768 rebellion of Ukrainian peasants against the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, led by Ivan Honta, headed the massacres of thousands of Jews in Uman in retaliation for their alliance with Polish forces. So then you have also real or imagined divergent political interests that promoted resentment and encouraged violence against the Jewish communities during the pogroms of the 1880s and early 1900s, many of which took place in southern Ukraine. But it was really the Russian Civil War that brought these differences to the fore in a new and critical way. By and large, at least at the start of the conflict, many Jews chose to support the Ukrainian national movement against Soviet power, and many young Zionists and Bundists fought on behalf of the Central Rada of Ukraine. But matters changed very quickly by early 1919 as the violence against the Jewish population intensified. More and more communal leaders and political activists shifted their allegiance and sought protection from the Red Army, which killed less Jews than other armies, or stopped killing them altogether, as even the staunchest anti-Bolsheviks turned into supporters of Soviet power. Often their choice was a reluctant one between the lesser of two evils, but it gave rise, nevertheless, to a vicious circle or a self-fulfilling prophecy. The more they supported the Reds, the more Ukrainian forces led by Simon Petliura's directory came to resent Jews for their pro-communist position, carrying out pogroms. And of course, the fact that Trotsky was the leader of the Red Army was not good for the Jews, who came to be identified as a compromised political actor. And the success with which the white forces, in particular, weaponized the discourse of Jewish communism through systematic propaganda, influenced Ukrainian troops and neighbors into seeing Jews as a threat to the Ukrainian dream of independence. So I got drawn into this chaos, because it is chaos, and I'm sure that that is what you got out of the context I just described, by Feigenberg, by Rachel Feigenberg. I hold her responsible, and I thought I would talk a little bit about her work and her experience. The great historian of Jewish life in Ukraine, Elias Cherikover, who made it his mission to chronicle anti-Jewish violence in Ukraine, turned to Rachel Feigenberg, who had distinguished herself already by 1919 for her talent as a Yiddish writer, so before the pogroms, and he gave her an assignment to write reports about the destruction of small Jewish settlements. He was conscious of the fact that, unlike previous waves of anti-Jewish violence during the Civil War, the Ukrainian shtetl became the epicenter of the pogrom. So this was an important assignment, and an assignment that she took quite seriously, also as a result of her own experience of the violence. So in the summer of 1922, the Eastern Jewish Historical Archive, which had recently moved to Berlin from Kyiv, where it had been established by Cherikover, to house thousands of original records, testimonies, and photographs about the pogroms, received from Odessa the documents written by Rachel Feigenberg. Maybe I'll come back to this slide in a minute. And especially this chronicle of a dead city, Churban Dubove, a Pinkes von der Teute Stadt, the chronicle of a dead city, about the destruction of the small shtetl, not too far from Uman. And this is an account that she put together after interviewing refugees that she met in Odessa who fled Uman. And she later developed this into a historical chronicle. But this account that I'm showing you here played actually a key role in the sensational Schwarzbad murder trial, which took place in Paris in 1927, when the young Ukrainian Jew Sholem Schwarzbad assassinated Petliura in revenge for the pogroms. And he was acquitted also because of the detailed account of destruction crafted by Feigenberg, and uses evidence during the trial. By the way, this account was also translated and published into French at the time, and she also helped write the defense for Schwarzbad. So I think her voice that comes across in the historical chronicle that then she developed, right, and she published as a book and came out in Warsaw in 1926, allows us really to grasp some multidimensional aspects of this violence, helping us to expand our understanding of the human experience of the pogroms. She focuses, for instance, on the Jewish home at the time of the pogroms, on how the violence influenced everyday life and neighborly relations, how it impinged on the family unit, affecting men and women differently, but also how it reshaped future life choices of many victims who became refugees. She also reminds us how the homes of non-Jewish neighbors could offer refuge and protection to those who fled the pogroms. After all, coexistence, as I said, and not violence, had been the constant marker of relations between Jews and non-Jews in any town of Ukraine over the centuries. Stories of suspension of violence are not always easy to recover. More often than not, witness accounts and survivor testimonies tend to focus on the details of betrayal, on those who took part in the looting and killing rather than on the assistance they might have received from their neighbors during the pogroms. Understandably, the trauma of death and loss could skew the memory of the experience of the pogroms, inspiring victims to remember or to report only those instances in which they were denied refuge by their neighbors, and forget or choose to silence at the time those cases in which the home of strangers became a site of rescue. Feigenberg recorded her own journey fleeing the violence from her Ukrainian shtetl in the winter of 1919. She fled in haste with her newborn son and managed to survive thanks to the peasants in nearby villages. She actually hid with her son for the whole summer and fall. And different peasants took her and her son into their homes. Feigenberg does not describe these homes and does not reveal the peasants' identities, but she acknowledged one woman in particular in her memoirs, who saved her by helping her mask her Jewish identity. She gave her traditional folk dress and a little cross to put around her child's neck to disguise him as a Christian boy. In a way, the woman who provided assistance to Feigenberg did so by bequeathing her with a piece of her home. We can assume that the dress and the cross were not only closely connected to her ethno-national identity, but also to the history and memory of her home. These were personal items that she shared with a Jewish woman and her son. In turn, in order to save herself and her son, Feigenberg took with her a piece of the woman's home. Feigenberg's powerful accounts of the anti-Jewish violence during the Civil War also confirmed the role that gender played in dictating the suspension of violence and in shaping neighborly attitudes and relations at the time of the pogroms. Gender mattered for the refugee experience. Hiding among neighbors and disguising one's identity in order to escape the violence might have been easier for Jewish women than it was for men. In Dubove, a Ukrainian neighbor offered safety and refuge in his home to many Jewish women and children who survived the 3 pogroms carried out in the shtetl. In exchange for furniture, and personal objects of value, he allowed the widows and orphans to hide in his home. As a refugee interviewed by Feigenberg in Odessa noted, quote, his home became an exhibit of Jewish furniture and objects, and the Dubove peasants called him the Jewish Bachko, the Jewish father. This chronicle also sheds light on some choices that Jews made in response to the pogroms. Witnessing and experiencing the violence had long-term consequences for generations of younger Jews living in Ukraine, galvanizing political choices spanning from communism to Zionism, in some cases triggering desire for revenge, in others influencing the relation to the local population and to the state authorities, or ignited an extraordinary refugee crisis with internal migration towards large cities and external migration towards other areas of Europe, America, or Palestine. One of the survivors in Dubove, Moshe Schwarzman, the shtetl's wheelwright, refused to remain in Dubove at the end of the war and live amongst his neighbors who had either witnessed the massacre of the Jews as bystanders or had participated in the violence. Despite some of his neighbors' attempts to convince him to stay, together with the surviving members of his family, Moshe Schwarzman left Dubove for Odessa, where he claimed Russians and Ukrainians will be ashamed to carry out pogroms. When Feigenberg first recounted her near-to-death experience of fleeing toward Odessa, she recalled her fine small town home in the Ukrainian shtetl with its trees below its windows, which was completely destroyed. This was the space marked by the quotidian, connected to the preparation of food, to the aromas of vegetables and fruit, to the seasons, untouched by the ravage of the pogroms. To be sure, Feigenberg never contemplated the possibility of returning to this space, first and foremost because her home had been demolished. Not only would she never return to the shtetl between Balta and Odessa, but like thousands of other refugees, she left the region for good. She reached the Romanian border, then made her way into Poland, and eventually arrived in Palestine. But she did not relinquish the memory of the pogroms, which resurfaced with renewed power precisely during World War II, when she herself translated her work, especially the three accounts, into Hebrew in 1940, 1942, and 1943, and then she collected them in this volume that was published much later in Israel, in the state of Israel. To conclude, let me dwell on the question of politics of memory. There are continuities, I think, between Russia's weaponization and distortion of history and the Soviet politics of memory with regard to the memory of this violence in the interwar period, which is a reminder of the deep ambivalence of the Soviet state toward the memory of the pogroms. While the state condemned them on paper, it was often eager to ignore them or weaponize the memory of these pogroms in its best interest. With regard to the pogroms, the Soviets shifted between acknowledging and downplaying the anti-Jewish violence, and the Soviets were ambiguous in their treatment of the perpetrators, creating a state-controlled narrative. Here you see the town of Trostinets in the Vinica region after the pogrom. And here you see a memorial at Trostinets, where in Russian and Yiddish, I don't think you can see it, but the inscription reads in both languages, here rest 337 Jews of Trostinets brutally murdered on May 9th, 10th, 1919 by the enemies of the Soviet state. So the message conveyed to anyone who walked by the memorial was very clear and unambiguous. The Soviet state commemorated, remembered, and guarded Jews against anti-Jewish violence and knew who the enemies were. Still standing today, by the way. When the discussion of the pogroms was perceived as at odds with the regime's interests and priorities of building socialism based on the brotherhood of peoples, then the memory of anti-Jewish violence was silenced. Victims were universalized, and the Soviets preferred not to investigate or punish the perpetrators. We have many trials against pogromchiki in the early 1920s who are either not punished or whose crimes of killing Jews are not mentioned in the verdicts. On the other hand, the Soviet state could make use of pogroms to advance its own interests. One of these being countering Ukrainian nationalism, identified as a threat for the Soviet Union. For example, at the time of the 1926 trial against Schwarzbard that I mentioned earlier, who assassinated Petliura, the Soviet press widely covered the events and collected documents to prove Ukrainian and Petliura's responsibility for the pogroms, and sent these documents to Paris to be used as evidence at the trial. But the state also used the trial as a pretext to carry out a systematic campaign against Ukrainian nationalism and its leaders. This campaign reemerged with force in 1929 when the secret police arrested the members of underground Ukrainian organizations, or alleged underground Ukrainian organizations, for conspiring against the Soviet Union on behalf of a Ukrainian independence. The preoccupation with Petliura was ideologically straightforward and allowed the Soviets to accomplish their objective. It confirmed the wickedness of the political enemy embodied by Ukrainian nationalism, allowing them to conduct purges in Soviet Ukraine, including of people who had nothing to do with Petliura. During the Great Terror, many Ukrainians were arrested as Petliurites. Last minute. Let's move to the present day, and think about the memory of the pogroms and anti-Jewish violence from the Civil War. The war that Russia has launched against Ukraine since 2014 has, of course, unleashed a wave of nationalist sentiment. And with it, you also had the naming of streets and memorial events for Petliura. So we see a public rehabilitation of Simon Petliura. In May of 2016, for the first time, the country even observed a minute of silence in memory of Petliura to mark the 90th anniversary of his assassination. As a freedom fighter for Ukrainian people, Petliura is generally not held accountable for, or it's not part of the narrative, the anti-Jewish violence. And certainly it is complicated. Certainly glorification rarely fits together with vilification in national histories and memories. And the identity of a hero rarely conflates with that of a perpetrator. But I want to dwell on something different. In 2005, on the initiative of Putin, the remains of General Anton Denikin, who was responsible for some of the worst pogroms against Jews during the Civil War on Ukrainian territory, were returned to Moscow and buried in the cemetery of the Donskoy Monastery. And Putin laid flowers on the Moscow grave of the White Russian leader again in May 2009, and sanctioned him as the symbol of the indivisibility of Russia, confirming a trend to glorify the past through the restoration of this forgotten national hero, who was also a pogromchik. So, you know, when we think about the politics of memory, the pogromist Denikin is turned into a national hero and the guardian of Russian patriotism and nationalism. Thank you.
Sorry about the microphone jiggling. Okay, so I do need, Chrissy, do I need your help to get at my slides again? Oh, we minimized it. Beautiful. Oh, I see. Were they? Oh, here. Oh. I'm gonna go. It's this. There we go. Beautiful. Okay. All right. It's up and working. Thank you so much to my colleagues at Penn for inviting me to give this presentation. It is such a pleasure to be here, and I'm so honored to be presenting and really thrilled to be presenting together with my colleagues, Elissa and Jeff. So I'm going to be working from 2 screens. So if I forget to advance, please tell me. This is a photo that you see in front of you from this past March 3rd, 2022. This was a day when Russian missiles struck a television tower and hit one of the off-site museum structures for the Babyn Yar Memorial. It killed 5 civilians. And President Zelensky said later in his public address to the nation, "We all died again in Babyn Yar from a missile attack." The address was actually posted to his social media accounts alongside a Hebrew translation. And the fact that Ukrainians could identify with the missile attack with Babyn Yar, the Holocaust killing site where somewhere between 37,000 and 150,000 people died during the Nazi occupation of Kyiv, speaks to something important that's been changing in Ukraine over the past roughly 8 years. And this is a changing discourse around identity. Since the 2013-2014 Euromaidan revolution, or the revolution of dignity, Ukrainian discussions about national memory and tragedy have broadened to become more inclusive. Some people have called this a civic turn in Ukrainian identity. This is a widespread shift in defining what it means to be a Ukrainian, from the ethnic, right, i.e. ethnically Ukrainian versus ethnically Jewish, to the civic, so people who live in Ukraine. And this includes people of Jewish, Ukrainian, Roma, Tatar, or Russian extraction. And I believe that one way that this has happened has been through the extension of very specific signifiers for collective memory and collective mourning of tragedies like Babyn Yar. So I've used the term passwords in my own work. Passwords are untranslatable terms that admit other groups into a collective fold. In Zelensky's case, he's linking all Ukrainians to the mass tragedy of the Holocaust on Ukrainian soil. Ukrainian-Jewish relations in Ukraine, as Elissa has just beautifully illustrated, have a troubled history, not always troubled, but we can't ignore that fact. 2 peoples who were marginalized in the Russian Empire as well as in the Soviet Union at various points came into conflict and into competition with one another. We can think of numerous examples, and Elissa has already shared some with us. The 17th century Khmelnytsky uprisings against Poland, when thousands of Jews died as collateral damage. In the immediate post-Soviet period, when Ukrainians and Jews sometimes vied in a sort of competitive victimhood for attention and airspace to commemorate their respective genocides, right? Ukrainians were trying to find the space and the audience to mourn the loss of the Holodomor, and Jews were trying to do the same around the Holocaust. So the relationship between Jews, Ukrainians, and Russian imperial presences, and I include the Soviet Union in this, that ruled over the territory of Ukraine, are complex. But Ukrainians and Jews have also encountered moments of rapprochement. And this has included aspects of the Soviet experience when, both thanks to and in spite of aspects of Soviet ideology, members of both groups looked to one another to describe their own group's experience. So in some cases, Jews and Ukrainians, in fact, looked to each other to help to explain their conditions of alienation in the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union. And I'm going to focus in my time I have today on one case study. This is the Yiddish poet David Hofstein, an innovator with language and verse from the modernist period until his death in 1952. His translations and borrowings from the 19th century Romantic poet Taras Shevchenko, who wrote in primarily Ukrainian. Hofstein spent a year in, he came of age as a modernist in Kyiv, and he ended up spending a year in Palestine in the mid-1920s, but returned to the Soviet Union in 1926. And upon his return, a few years later, he complained to his friend and cousin Hirsch Blaustein that Soviet Yiddish culture lacked cultural traditions or Kulturtraditias. And I believe that he was looking for them wherever he could get them, including in Ukrainian literature and Ukrainian culture. So David Hofstein was born in the shtetl Korostyshev, which is just outside of Kyiv, and he came of age in Kyiv. His early poems were often poems about rootlessness. They were poems about wandering, and you can see the first lines on your slides. Dank euch Wanderwegen breite, vermiede Glieder Wanderstoiv. Thank you, wide wanderways, for tired limbs, wander dust. Hofstein's early poetry about Ukraine tends to place the Jewish alienated subject into a hostile Ukrainian landscape. His pogrom poem, Ukraina, which you see at the bottom of this slide, appeared in his 1922 book, Troyer, or Sorrow, and it begins with the stanza that you see on the slide. Bloody near and bloody far, Fastov, you've just heard about Fastov from Elissa, Vasilkov, and more. Blutig Noentel and Blutig Fremde, Fastov, Vasilkov, und noch. So he was writing in the wake of the horrific pogroms of the Ukrainian Civil War, sometimes known as the Russo-Polish War, and Hofstein uttered the names of Fastov and Vasilkov, or Fastiv, as it is in Ukrainian, as passwords that evoke a collective understanding of specifically Ukrainian pogroms in the same way that Nemirov and Tolchin denoted the pogroms that had been carried out by Khmelnytsky and his Cossack troops during the 17th century. Only in 1936 did Hofstein dedicate a book of poems to the city of his poetic origins, Kyiv, or Kiev in Ukrainian, in Yiddish. And this is where he remembers the old cave from 15 years ago, Zurück mit 15 weite Jahr, and rejoices that now your old magnificent is dressed in new power and new happiness. So this, we can see here, helps to describe a certain change in Hofstein's writing, a change in his relationship to Ukraine, the country where he'd been born, the country where he had to which he had returned. So Hofstein would again write about violence during World War II, but he writes not about violence against specifically Jews, but violence much more generally speaking. You see his 1944 poem, Ukraina, another poem called Ukraina, at the bottom of the slide. I'll just read this in English. From smoke and from woe and from ash and from shame, I see you lift your damaged hand. Your head rises, pasted in blood. I see your face. Oh, it lives. Oh, it lives. Your still childish look, now with motherly pain. And it lights up the joy that follows danger, the knowledge that follows confusion and error, like water in the spring from under the ice. So like his 1922 poem that I shared with you earlier, he writes to Ukraine in the second person familiar, but this time Hofstein is casting Ukraine as a child who has emerged from the violence of the Civil War, and in fact, the violence of the Nazi occupation, as a young woman with motherly pain. Just to share with you how this poem continues, because it gets a little strange. I see now, and this is towards the end, I see now your body, your image is rising, how your clothing's remains can barely contain it, and the dirty rags fall from your body. You can see it, a child grown into a wife. It's a stunning body with beauty that shines. through shame and through mockery and through the violence of hate. This isn't quite the end, but it's sort of towards the end of the poem. So we have this kind of bizarre sexual unveiling happening here, right? I see your body. Hofstein's depicting a feminized Ukraine who, having been violated and battered, is now undressed, admired, and deemed ready for marriage. Precisely who is going to betroth the new Ukraine, whether it's the people, Stalin, or Russia, is initially somewhat vague. But by the end of the poem, Hofstein suggests that the husband may be none other than the Yiddish poet himself. And he ends it with, "It's Ukraine, my home, Ukraine, my land. It's Ukraine, mein Heim, Ukraine, mein Land." So the poem is both a reconciliation and a kind of sexual conquest, and one that is, we have to assume, not entirely consensual. The shame and mockery, the Schand und Spott, mentioned at the opening and closing of the poem, allow for an interpretation that the Soviet people, Jews included, have thrived at Ukraine's expense. And Hofstein appears to be writing here on a couple of different registers: Soviet optimism and national tragedy. The new Ukraine will be better for Soviet internationalism, but Ukrainians are going to lose something of their beloved homeland. And he's constantly making clear that he's somewhat aware of this fact, even as he's writing as a more or less good internationalist. So what happened between the publication of Hofstein's first 1922 Ukraine and his 1944 Ukraine? Well, a lot of things happened, obviously, the World War II for one, but he'd also moved to Palestine and then returned. And less obviously, upon his return, Hofstein was rewriting his own poetics of alienation and marginality, right? As well as a kind of poetics of national solidarity. He's no longer focusing on a rootless Jewish subject, but rather on the territorially rooted, if still marginal, Ukrainian subject. And this is something that we see in many Soviet and Soviet-aligned Yiddish writers in the late 1920s and 1930s in particular. In an effort to counter the rise of fascism and speak about solidarity across nations, writers rewrote their earlier poems about Jewish suffering to describe the struggles of others around the world. Hofstein's, of course, doing it at home, but with the ethnic other. Hofstein did this in a couple of different ways. One was through the kind of weird programmatic poetry about Ukraine that I've just shared with you. But a more important turn in his poetry was through translation. So Hofstein spent over a decade translating the Ukrainian romantic poet Taras Shevchenko. The sentiments of alienation that Hofstein had expressed in his own 1922 Troyer were not that far from Shevchenko's 1838 observation while in exile from his native Ukraine, that people are different abroad. It's hard to live with them. You'll have no one with whom to cry or talk. На чужини на ті люди тяжко з ними жити, ні з ким буде поплакати, ні поговорити. So this, and you can also kind of hear some of the maybe rhythmic connections, although this is a very short excerpt. The poetics of alienation, whether alienation of Jews in Ukraine or of Ukrainians in Imperial Russia, connect the two poets despite their utterly different relationships to Ukraine itself. So Hofstein's first translation of the Ukrainian bard, Taras Shevchenko, appeared in 1927. This was a Yiddish edition of Veidlinger's Russian language biography of Shevchenko, and he continued translating Shevchenko throughout the 1930s. He translated, among other things, 3 book-length translations of Shevchenko's poems and prose, which appeared in 1939 in time for Shevchenko's celebration of his 125th birthday, posthumously. In 1940, Hofstein became a member of the Communist Party, and his colleagues, in fact, Kvitko and Markish, also became party members around the same time, Markish in 1939 and Kvitko in 1941. Their engagement with other national minorities played a direct role in this. It's helpful to write about other peoples in this large international nation-building project that the Soviet Union was engaged in. The state publishing houses were gradually in the process of canonizing representative writers in Russian as well as national minority languages. Pushkin became our everything, once again in Russian. Sholem Aleichem eventually would become the representative Yiddish writer, and Ukrainians were given Shevchenko, who was widely celebrated in 1939 for his 125th birthday, as I mentioned. So that year there was a monument to Shevchenko erected in Kyiv, and Nikita Khrushchev, who at the time headed the Communist Party in Ukraine, delivered a speech at its unveiling. Khrushchev said, "All the peoples of the Soviet Union lovingly translate the poetry of Shevchenko, a Ukrainian poet, into their own languages." That same year, Kyiv's St. Vladimir University was renamed Taras Shevchenko University. And Shevchenko was translated into basically all of the languages. So curiously, the Yiddish language monographs about Shevchenko that accompanied the 1939 celebration offered a kind of unlikely space for contemporary Jewish writers to discuss how a nation could assert its cultural heritage in the Soviet Union. And you have a couple cited up here. In a 1939 Yiddish language biography, Petro Altman wrote, "Nowhere have the masses valued their kobzar as highly as here in our Soviet Union. Under the flag of Lenin Stalin, all peoples live free in our land. They build and create their cultures to be national in form and socialist in content." Hofstein and I'll just note that a kobza is a traditional Ukrainian instrument, and Taras Shevchenko's very famous volume of poems, which he kept rewriting throughout his career, was called the kobza, right? Really the lyric poet, basically. Hofstein, in one of his translator's introductions, remarked that only the proletariat under the leadership of the Bolshevik Party of Lenin Stalin led the peasant to battle. So the discussion of the Ukrainians as a people should not be overlooked as mere Stalinist rhetoric. Rather, it might be read as thinly coded language for discussing the role of national minorities in the Soviet Union. There is, Altman and Hofstein both appear to have decided, space for closely examining a nation within the socialist state, but it's best if it's someone else's nation. So that Hofstein wrote programmatically about the Ukrainian romantic attests to a really important aspect of his own project. His translations were simultaneously ideological renderings of Shevchenko for a Soviet Jewish audience and linguistic renderings of Ukrainian into Yiddish. And by steeping himself in the work of Shevchenko, who was canonized to great fanfare as a kind of proto-Marxist, Hofstein was rebuilding his relationship to the Soviet Union as well as to his native Ukraine. So I want to dig into a little bit of the text, and if we have time in the question and answer section, I can bring in more, but this is just an example. So beyond a sense of alienation as minority poets, Hofstein and Shevchenko also shared strictly formal sensitivities. Hofstein's wordplay, his alliteration, his internal rhymes complement Shevchenko's alliterative Ukrainian, and he knew this. He also was well aware that his readers were also reading Shevchenko. Most of them could read in Ukrainian, even if they didn't speak it. So take the last line of Shevchenko's most famous poem, Zapovit, or Testament, where Shevchenko's speaker prepares to leave the hills and valleys of Ukraine to meet his maker. And sorry, it's not the very last line, but the bottom arrow that you see up on your screen. So for Shevchenko, it's Sepokino I polino. So literally, I'll leave it all, or I'll leave and abandon. And Hofstein, first of all, creates a new internal rhyme, Verlosen, sich losen, als verlosen und sich losen. So he matches this Sepokino I polino of Shevchenko, but he also preserves Shevchenko's vowel sounds. He ends up taking Shevchenko's boha, which means God, and finding the Yiddish word trogun to kind of match that to create an intertextual rhyme, right? So we have this Sepokino I polino dosa moho boha in Ukrainian. I'll pick up and leave everything and go to God himself. This is very rough translation. Als verlosen und sich losen bis die Himmeln trogun. So there's no mention of God, it's just die Himmeln, it's the heavens for Hofstein, but he still gets the sound of boha in trogun. A more virtuosic example of a very similar preservation of sound appears a little bit earlier in the red arrow in the same poem, Testament, where Hofstein renders Shevchenko's wonderfully sort of virtuosic phrase, "Lani shirokopoli," wide-skirted or wide-brimmed fields, as "breitpoledika lonkes," broad-rimmed fields. This is not a normal word to use in Yiddish, breitpoledika. Maybe you'll use it for a broad-brimmed hat or some kind of broad skirt or something, but the felicitous reappearance of pola, which means field, allows Shevchenko's own surprisingly long word to shine through in the Yiddish, despite the linguistic distance between the Germanic Yiddish and the Slavic Ukrainian. And internal rhymes and alliteration are often the first thing that Shevchenko's other translators dismiss, and these include people like Pasternak, who really Russianizes Shevchenko into a kind of Pushkin-sounding poet, abandoning most of the alliteration in Ukrainian. So given what we can observe about Hofstein's immersion in Shevchenko's very anti-imperial poetry of the time, and what we know of Hofstein's own belief in a cultural continuity or desire for cultural continuity, how should we understand his programmatic writings about Kyiv in the 1930s? By the 1930s, Russia was emerging as the dominant center of communist internationalism, despite this sort of superficial celebration of diversity that took place under the guise of the Soviet indigenization project, or Korenizatsiya. Under Stalin's Soviet nationalities policy, a nation could only be considered as such if it lay claim to a territory. As Ronald Suny has articulated, Soviet territorial administrative units, quoting Suny here, provided clear political and territorial identities as alternatives to earlier religions and solidarities. And this territorialization of official nationhood left Jews, most of whom did not really consider Birobidzhan to be a serious nation or a serious homeland, vulnerable to the accusation of cosmopolitanism, anti-Soviet Zionism, or both usually. One result of this project was that Soviet Jewish writers increasingly relied on literary passwords from other national minorities to build alliances, and also to highlight the Jewish experience. It was okay, again, to talk about nation if it was somebody else's nation, if it was Shevchenko's and not your own. So this is from Hofstein's 1935 book, Kyiv, and he's emphasizing here the territory of Ukraine as a place that he can talk about when he talks about nationhood. So in his discussion of his own city, he writes, "My city has met me anew and has embraced me with joy, left a suburb and came home to a capital." This poem, Kyiv Hauptstadt, or Kyiv Capital City, is celebrating, of course, the 1934 transfer of the capital of Soviet Ukraine from Kharkiv to Kyiv. It includes, the whole book includes poems about the Palace of the Pioneers, Dynamo Kyiv, which is the soccer team founded in the 1920s. And importantly, I think Tsientsian, who is a Chinese hero described by a Ukrainian poet, Terashenko, who purportedly died defending Kyiv from the White Army. There's also a poem about the Mikhailov Monastery. It's celebrating the demolition of the monastery and the creation of an administrative building in its place. But he's writing about how great Kyiv is partly for Jews at this point in the 1930s. So we see in the second quote up here, "What's a ghetto? No one knows. Every dawn dawns for everyone there." Now, the book in its entirety is a collection of impressions of a kind of Kyivan promised land and descriptions of a new space that's done away with anti-Semitism in the ghetto. And it resonates in striking ways with Zionist conversations of the time. At least one reader has argued that Hofstein's engagement with Ukraine might be read as evidence of his latent Zionism, or at least with his latent disillusionment with the Soviet Union as his homeland. And this was the Vilna Yiddish poet Avram Sutzkever. Sutzkever was a Yiddish poet from Vilna. He miraculously managed to escape the Vilna ghetto and was airlifted to the Soviet Union in 1944. He ended up spending time with a lot of Soviet Yiddish poets, and that included Hofstein. Sutzkever later claims that he, at one point in a conversation with Hofstein, confronted Hofstein about a poem that Hofstein had written dedicated to the Cossack hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky, whose troops had decimated the Ukrainian Jewish population, of course, in 1648. How could Hofstein, Sutzkever wanted to know, write a poem venerating the hetman with a sword outstretched to the east? And ignore the quote on your slide right now. We can come back to that in the Q&A. So the poem in question was probably Hofstein's poem Denkmal Khmelnytskin, which appears midway through the book Kiev. Sutzkever's memory is a little faulty, for the poem does not include a reference to the east, but rather to the north. The published poem, which you see in front of you in its entirety, is inscrutable, but I've translated it more or less literally here. If Khmelnytsky beckoned up there to the north, and the Tsar thought, and the powerful lords, or maybe he meant to write, meaning the Tsar and the powerful lords, he has ungemeint pot der Tsar und die britische Macht. The frosty wind, this meaning then scattered in heroic years of bloody battle. And in toil, the correct directions now found by every citizen of our brotherly land. In happy toil, the reward has been won by every free, honorable human hand. So the poem is, needless to say, ambiguous. Hofstein's allusion to a frosty wind, a frostige Wind, that confused the proper order of things suggests the subsequent Russian cruelty against Ukrainians that followed Khmelnytsky's yielding of the Ukrainian territories to Muscovy in 1654. The idea that the new Soviet citizens in toil, in me, have resolved this Russian-Ukrainian brotherhood appears, at least at first glance, to be a kind of renewed celebration of the brotherhood that Khmelnytsky had willingly or reluctantly established between the Ukrainian and Russian lands. But according to Sutzkever, after his criticism of Hofstein about the poem, the latter brought him the poem, took Sutzkever into the washroom where the room wouldn't be bugged, and said, do you know what those lines mean? The sword is raised to us again, to us Jews. The conversation makes more sense if we apply it not to Sutzkever's misremembered line about a sword raised to the east, but rather to the line that we have above, in which Khmelnytsky beckoned or gewinkt to the north. So buried in Hofstein's portrayal of Russian-Ukrainian brotherhood is a kind of anxiety about a renewed anti-Semitic sentiment that's infiltrating Russia. Sutzkever recalls that following Hofstein's explanation, he whispered, a Marano. Hofstein is a Marano. Well, this interpretation of Hofstein's poem becomes a little bit more accessible if we return to Shevchenko, who in 1859 admonished the great hetman Bogdan Khmelnytsky, and this is the quote down at the bottom, "Як би то ти, Богдане п'яний, тепер на Переяслав глянув." If only you, drunken Bogdan, could look at Peryaslav now. This line was edited out of most of the Soviet period editions of Shevchenko's work. For Shevchenko, whose oeuvre Hofstein knew as well as anyone, Khmelnytsky was not a nation builder, but a compromiser, whose 1654 treaty with Muscovy had led to centuries of Ukrainian subjugation. Hofstein's Khmelnytsky was Shevchenko's Khmelnytsky, a fateful unifier, compromiser, a traitor. Placed in the middle of Hofstein's 1936 Kiev volume, this ungrammatical two-stanza poem about confusion was a poem about dangerous unions, about being in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I want to end by trying to draw a few more comparisons today. And I realize that I'm threading a very precarious needle because the 1930s were years of alignment with Moscow. And that's what Hofstein was doing. Whether he wanted to or not, he was officially aligning himself with Stalin. And today's Kremlin is bombing Ukraine, sometimes under the rhetoric of Soviet-style internationalism. But what I do see happening now is that the subversive solidarity that sometimes, and only sometimes, united Jews and Ukrainians during the Soviet years has become a kind of important part of the post-Maidan Ukrainian identity formation. And an especially striking example of current uses of a poetic password comes from Mariana Kianovska's 2017 poetic cycle, Babyn Yar Holosami, or Babyn Yar in Voices. The book has recently come out in Oksana Maksimchuk and Max Razuchinsky's translation into English. Almost all of the voices in Kianovska's Babyn Yar cycle are Jewish, But there's this one passage that stands out for its merging of Ukrainian and Jewish trauma. And I think it holds a key for understanding not only Kianovska's cycle of poems about Babyn Yar, but also the larger phenomenon of the civic turn in contemporary Ukrainian culture. I think it also potentially helps us to find a way toward reconciling Soviet Jewish identities and a contemporary Ukrainian struggle for identity. So I'll end by reading these lines in English and then Ukrainian. Ivan says to Nava, "This place resembles Babylon, except what's getting mixed are not languages, but silences, bones. Even though bodies are kept separate, I, for one, hang on to my folks from 33, you to your newcomers from 41. Іван каже Нави, дивися, це місце немов Вавилон, але тут у нас перемішано немове мовчання і кості. Хоча деякі не перемішано, я зі своїми з 33-го, ти зі своїми з 41-го, ви тут були новенькі. And she's referring, of course, here to the mixture of tragedies, 1941 being the year of the major Babyn Yar massacre and 1933 being the year of the beginning of the Holodomor or Ukrainian famine. So I'll go ahead and stop there. Thank you so much.
Hey, how does this go on? All right, hi everyone. So given the time of where we're at and kind of the late hour and stuff, I think I'm just going to talk for a little bit, do a little much shorter, probably for like 5 minutes, and maybe show you a video or so. But I want to focus my remarks on one particular issue because Ukraine is at war right now, which is why I think we're here predominantly talking about Ukraine today. And I also recognize that we're also commemorating the Holocaust. I want to talk about that too. So I want to really discuss one particular problem or one particular issue that people have been raising. And that's the framing that Russian President Vladimir Putin has posed about this war, which is that it's a war against fascism. And this has caused a lot of consternation in the West by people who do not see it as a war against fascism for very good reason. And I'll explain that. But I want to really talk about why that has resonance right now in Russia and in Ukraine in a way that it may not hear so much. So to begin with, let me state outright that this is not, that Putin is not waging a war against fascism. In fact, quite the contrary. Ukraine today is a pluralistic and democratic state, and that's actually what Putin is waging war against. I believe that he recognizes that Ukrainians and Russians have a lot in common, and if democracy and Western values can spread in Ukraine and work very well in Ukraine, he knows that they can work well in Russia as well. And that's why he's going to war, is to battle pluralism, democracy, and Western ideas. But he knows that he can gain support from among the majority of the Russian population if he frames it as a war against fascism. And in the West, a lot of people have been asking, how is this possible that people can believe it's a war against fascism when Ukraine has a president who identifies as Jewish? Which is a good question. But I want to kind of explain a little bit how that works, and then in the process, maybe say a word or two about my own work that I've done in Ukraine. And that's, to see how that works, one has to understand the way, really the cult of World War II in Russia, where the 20th century has not been a great century for Russia. Russia's actually had a lot of centuries that aren't so great, but the 20th century in particular has not worked out well for Russia. But one thing that did work out relatively well is their defeat of Nazism and their defeat of fascism. And in the Russian mindset, they view themselves as the people who defeated Nazism. They view Russia as the last bastion against Nazism and regard themselves as having defeated Nazism. Now, this is also important because in the Russian mindset and in the Soviet mindset, the way that the Soviet Union portrayed the war, it was not, and the way they portrayed Nazism, it was not Nazism was not a ideology against the Jews. And they don't view the Holocaust as a distinct part of the war. They view Nazism as an ideology against communism. And so the big battle of the 20th century was a battle between communism and a battle between fascism. And it's a battle in the Soviet mindset that communism won, and that was the greatest victory of Russia. And as a result of which, they don't really emphasize the anti-Semitism of Nazism or of fascism. So this is why there's not really a discordant note in the idea that a fascist state can be run by a Jew. Because for them, fascism, or that a Nazi state for that matter, can be run by a Jew. Because for them, Nazism is about anti-communism. It's not about anti-Semitism. So I think we kind of need to understand that, to understand what they think, how that ideology is working. And then in connection with that, I want to say a few things about how the Holocaust is understood in Ukraine, or has been understood in Ukraine during the Soviet period, and also how it was understood in the Soviet Union. And that's to say that many of the iconic things that we associate with the Holocaust did not take place. It was not experienced by Soviet Jews. About a third of the victims of the Holocaust were killed in the Soviet Union, but they tended not to experience death camps. They tended not to have been killed by gassing. That iconic association of the Holocaust was, for the most part, not in the Soviet Jewish experience or in the Ukrainian Jewish experience. The experience of being carted across Europe in sealed freight cars, railway cars, that also did not happen in the Soviet Union for the most part. And these are, when you go to any Holocaust museum, these are the, key moments that they identify as the Holocaust. And so a lot of Soviet Jews, and particularly in Ukraine, didn't really associate themselves with that experience. So they lived through something, but they didn't live through something that they identified with the gas chambers and with sealed railway cars. And instead, the 2 million or so Jews who were murdered by the Nazis in Soviet territories tended to be killed close to home in an initial wave of killings that took place between June 22nd, 1941, and about October, November of 1941, and then again in the following spring, in May and June of 1942. During that period, about 2 million Jews were killed in Ukraine. Again, close to home. Most of them were killed before the death camps even began functioning. The death camps, the first death camp, Chelmno, began functioning in the fall of 1941, but the gas chambers in Treblinka and Majdanek and Sobibor did not begin functioning until the spring of 1942, by which point most of the Holocaust had already happened in Ukraine. So they didn't really associate themselves with that experience. And instead, many of the survivors of the Holocaust in Ukraine associate themselves with the victory of the Red Army. So they tended to view themselves not as victims of the Holocaust, but as victors, as people who participated in the Red Army and who fought the Germans. And I want to show you a couple of little video clips as an illustration of that. To begin, to say something about the video clips, between 2002 and 2010, I would go over the summers traveling through Ukraine with my colleague Dovber Kurler, who's a Yiddish linguist, and we would look for elderly Yiddish speakers in Ukraine and interview them about their lives. He was doing a linguistic experiment. He was trying to interview them about where Yiddish accents change. But there was a part of the interview where we just asked people to tell us about their lives. And in this part, they talked about the war. And they would call it the war, not the Holocaust. Nobody we spoke to about 500 people, and almost none of them used the term the Holocaust or any Yiddish or Russian or Ukrainian equivalent of the term Holocaust. They spoke about the war, because for them, what they experienced was simply part of the war. They didn't take it out as something distinct from the Holocaust. And to just kind of go on that point before, so anyway, well, yeah, so we were interviewing these people. I'm going to play a few video clips of the interviews. But just to go on that point about them integrating it within the war experience, I want to kind of compare that for a minute and have you compare it with the experiences of, say, somebody like Elie Wiesel, who popularized the way we think about the Holocaust today. And he's coming out of Auschwitz and then suddenly appearing in Paris. And for him, the experience that he endured was so radically different than what anybody else around him endured, that the Holocaust acquires this, this special significance. I think about my own father as a Holocaust survivor as well. And he often spoke about being in school in the 1950s in Toronto, where he was dealing with experiences, unimaginable experiences that he had endured as a child only 5 to 10 years before. And everybody else around him was talking about Elvis Presley and football. And how you come to terms with that and how you deal with that and integrate your own experiences is you say you've been through something unique, right? There's something, it's different than everything else. But for the people that we interviewed, they endured the Holocaust in their own form, and then they came back to towns that had been utterly destroyed by the war. And everybody else had also endured 3 years, 4 years, whatever it is, of warfare. And everybody else was rebuilding and had their homes destroyed as well. So they integrated their experiences into the experiences of the war in a different way. Where they think again of themselves as victims of the war, victors of fascism, rather than victims of the Holocaust. So I just want to play you a couple video clips that I think illustrate this point, and I think are kind of fun to watch. This first one is one of my favorites that we did. And it's of a fellow by the name of David Furman. And my team came into a soup kitchen where we found David Furman. He was just there, on a regular day, getting a free meal. And we came in with an international camera crew. And I wanted to see where the rabbi of the town is with us. And he says, David, tell us something. Tell me about your childhood. And you'll see how David answers. He says one thing about his childhood and then immediately jumps into his experience defending Stalingrad, because for him, that is his key moment of his life. And you'll see he also reaches into his pocket and he takes out a photo of himself in full military regalia, which, he didn't know there was going to be an international film crew at the soup kitchen that day. So he's carrying this photo of himself around wherever he goes and has it to show us at that moment. I was going to play you this clip for a minute and a half, and I'll play another clip, and then I'll finish up. I'm just going to try to make it louder. But... Okay, that was the question. Tell us about your childhood. One word, he says. And there, just again, he didn't know there was an international camera team at the soup kitchen that day, but he carries this photo with him, presumably wherever he goes, of his proudest moment of himself in military regalia when he defeated the Nazis. Okay, and that's how he ends it. That's, whoops, commercial. Don't need to see the commercial. Anyway, that's how he ends his story. I mean, that's the story of his life. Literally, the question again was, tell me about your childhood. And he tells in a minute and 40 seconds or whatever, tells about the Battle of Stalingrad and says, and that's my biography. That's my life. He also mentions when he came back, there was nobody left. And this is another theme that emerges in a lot of the stories that we heard, is people come back to these towns and they find nobody. Many of them knew that people had been killed. When they were fighting, they knew vaguely what had gone on in their towns, but they expected to come back and maybe a town that had 5,000 Jews before the war, maybe they expected a tenth of them would be killed. But they come back and they find that everybody is killed. His entire family, and in a subsequent interview, he told us about everybody who had been killed. And they have to rebuild these communities from scratch. And that becomes another part of their own experience, where the Holocaust for them doesn't end with 1945, but it continues. Many of them even remained in the military until like 1952, 1953, simply because they had nowhere else to go. You know, soldiers, since antiquity, soldiers go fighting, and then you come back from fighting and you come home and you're welcomed with open arms by your family. And for them, they came back and there was no family left to welcome them. Almost a unique experience in military history. So all they can do is stay in the military and fight. I want to play you another clip of Efim Skablitsky, who we met in Berdichev, and he talks about his experience in the army, and he focuses on the idea of revenge, which is also a prominent theme in the way that these people remember the war, the way that the Soviet Jews we interviewed remember the war. They think about the issue of revenge. You know, Elie Wiesel famously took out parts of revenge that appeared in the Yiddish version of Night before he published it in French translation and in English translation, because American audiences and French audiences didn't want to hear about revenge. But in the Soviet context, they spoke about revenge quite a lot. I just want you to listen to this 50-second clip. I think that's pretty, not the way people would speak about it in the West, but I find it very powerful. I got more of them than they got of mine. They killed my entire family, my parents, my little brother Motala, but I got more of them than they got of mine, he says. So that idea of remembering the war, remembering their role in the war is really important. These people, who and many of them were in camps, they were in concentration camps of various kinds, or they were in ghettos in Ukraine. And when the Red Army came in to liberate them, they then joined the Red Army and fought with them. And so they speak about this moment of being in the depths of the ghetto and then coming out and then being part of the army, literally going from being a victim to being a victor. One fellow that we interviewed, I won't play you the video of, but he talks about literally hiding in a chimney. He hid in the chimney for weeks, coming out just occasionally for air and for food, while he was waiting for the Red Army to come into town. As soon as the Red Army came to town, he joined up with them, and eventually he fought all the way to Berlin and claims that he was able to write his name on the Reichstag when the Soviets conquered Berlin. So literally going from, and he was earlier from that, he was in a camp and even crawled out of a mass grave. He was in a mass grave and managed to survive. So literally going from a mass grave to going to writing his name on the wall of the Reichstag. I'll skip this video because of time, but this is talking about issues of speaking Yiddish after the war, where people became very ashamed, Jews became very ashamed of their Jewishness after the war. The anti-Semitic propaganda of the Nazis had seeped into Soviet society, and there was a general feeling that Jews shirked their duty during the war. People in these towns looked around and saw, I fought, but where were all of the Jews? They weren't fighting with me. They didn't realize that the Jews had been killed or other Jews had been in evacuation. But there was a myth that the Jews didn't fight, that the Jews didn't fight in the war because the Jews had been killed. They just didn't, a lot of people didn't understand that. So he talks about the shame of that and the feeling that he was embarrassed to be Jewish, he was embarrassed to speak Yiddish after the war. But I'll finish on just this one video, which I think is kind of a cute video, of this couple, the Gellers, talking about how after the war they made a new life for themselves. And this became another common theme, is how do you make a new life for yourself with your entire community destroyed? how do you continue to live among these communities with the perpetrators living next door, literally next door down the street, and what you can do to reconstruct life. So I'll just play you this little kind of cute clip, and then I'll end on that. This was very hard to get an apartment after the war. And he's saying they could only get an apartment if they were married. So he just wanted to register. And she insisted on having a proper wedding. That's the message. Anyway, I'll end the video there, but it's just kind of a cute thing of them talking about the need to rebuild. Many people, when they returned to these towns, there were strangers living in their houses. Christians had moved into their houses. They had to get their houses back. They had to rebuild, and getting married and starting a new life was, for most people, a symbol that the war was finally over, that in many cases didn't begin until the 1950s, but still is, part of the trauma that they lived with for the rest of their lives, and that the whole country is currently living with, and that informs the current war in that crucial way that explains how Putin is able to claim that he's conducting a war against Nazism, and it makes sense within the Soviet context. So I will end on that, and thanks.
They both on? Yes. So let me start the conversation with questions from the audience. Yes, Beth. Oh, you know what? Okay, you guys will share a mic and I'll walk around.
So I want to, students in my class will be surprised at this question, since I'm always telling them when we're in the 19th century and the early 20th, we should stay there. But I want to ask a presentist question. You all talked about memory. You all talked about connections between two peoples who hold traumas, sometimes cooperate, sometimes not. But I want to ask how, you mentioned Zelensky and his Jewishness and how this figures into Putin's dialogue, but I want to ask specifically how Jewishness and Jewish place, all the sites of the war are so rich in Jewish history. And I want to ask the question about how memory is functioning in current discourse about the war and about the political dynamics. And you can take it wherever you want.
I'll try to answer briefly, and then I'll give it to them, which is, I think it's all, so much of this war is about memory. And it started, not only Jewish memory, but it's about memory as a whole. And it started in July of, July of 2019, when Putin gave a big, long speech on Ukraine. And in my circles, people were circulating that around, saying, there's going to be a war, where Putin was talking about how integral Ukraine is to Russian history, and how Ukrainians and Russians are part of the same people. It was really a war cry already then, and history plays into it all the time, that this is the claim that Ukraine is part of Russia. And in fact, Russian history, the way Russians regard their history, begins in Kiev. Kiev and Rus. Russia got its Christianity from Ukraine in the 10th century, and that in Russian, in Russian mythology is the beginning of Russian history. So for that, for Ukraine to be independent, really, I don't know, kicks at Russian historical memory. So it's not, you're asking about Jewish men, but maybe I'll let my colleagues take that part.
Yeah, I'll add, yeah, no, I'm glad you brought that up, because Putin also, I mean, there's also this long sort of dissertation that Putin published in July of 2021, right? So just a couple months before the troops started to surround Ukraine. That's what you meant. Okay, I was like, there was also a 2019. Okay, because it was just before, and he says in there something, I mean, and it's impressive in its scope, but it's also impressive in its obfuscation of fact. So it both accuses Ukrainians of Nazism, and it also says, and Ukrainians and Russians are the same people because of Christian orthodoxy. And it's it's sort of contradicting itself at every pass, but he calls Ukrainian anti-Russian sentiment a weapon of mass destruction. And then actually on the eve of the war in his speech evokes the invasion of Iraq. So there's a very, you can read it very much as that declaration of war. But I just wanted to add that I think Jewish memory figures in because of this civic turn that people have been talking about. And that's this idea that, I think it has something to do with the Russian accusation of Ukraine as being a kind of fascist right-wing state. And many Ukrainians, not all obviously, but many Ukrainians have responded by saying, actually, we are re-examining history. We're rethinking what all of history means. And this is where you get people like Yanovska writing a book-length poem about Babyn Yar and declaring that she's doing so because she didn't learn about the Holocaust that took place in her own Ukrainian town until adulthood. Or you have, someone like the filmmaker Loznitsa, who made a film about Babyn Yar, and it's a very controversial film, but he actually talks about Ukrainian culpability in Babyn Yar. And so there's a delving into a painful shared past. This is obviously not everyone who's doing that, but I think that evoking memory has also been a defense. It's been an offense by Russia, and Ukrainians have responded by trying to be better historians in some senses.
Okay, to add to that, in terms of memory, I want to bring as an example the use of the slogan, the leitmotif of this war, which is Slava Ukraini, right? Glory to Ukraine. And what is so interesting in connection to this idea of the civic turn is the way in which, this idea, this phrase, Slava Ukraini, has been brought back into the Jewish fold, so to speak. Just to give some context, Slava Ukraini was, usually the Ukrainians who collaborated with the Germans, especially members of the UPA and ON, right before they murdered Jews, they used to shout Slava Ukraini. So those who survived, Jews who survived, there's a very, there is an immediate association with this, with Slava Ukraini. But thanks to the civic turn, and perhaps also thanks to maybe also the presence of, the fact that the president of Ukraine is of Jewish background, this term has been normalized in a way. And I've talked to several historians, not Jewish historians, actually, Ukrainian historians, John Paul Himka, for example, who's written extensively about, this very tragic history of murder, Ukrainians killing Jews. And he resists, he will not say Slava Ukraini, right? Because for him, it's exactly like saying Heil Hitler. There is no difference. He said to me, and I was trying to talk to him about, this question of memory, this question of, and he's very resistant to this. At least as of 2 months ago, he was still resistant to this. I don't know. But I think that that's a very interesting example of a lens as to how, through memory, we can, open this window into what is happening now. And this, and the relationship between this new civic identity, the civic turn, and the memory of, a World War II. That's what comes to mind.
Thank you very much for all of the presentations. Jeff, I appreciate what you said very much, but may I just complicate it a little bit? Because it almost seemed in all of your description, but especially in yours, Jeff, as if the Ukraine is stable, but the borders shifted. And what is Western Ukraine now was Poland and not the Soviet Union until the end of World War II. That means people in Western Ukraine experienced precisely the Holocaust that you kind of put aside for the Ukraine. That means we have a country now that is complex because it doesn't have the Soviet experience for everybody, and especially a very split experience on the side of the Jews. And I think that has to be considered.
Yeah, I'll just say I agree. I agree. I mean, that's why I said I think most of them did not experience it that way. I did try to put in the most, but yes. Well, in Galicia as well, they, for the most part, did not experience camps. Most of the killings took place closer to home. In Transcarpathia, they did.
It's very different. I mean, if I look at my own family, just as an example, my grandmother was proudly Austrian, my mother proudly Polish, my father studied under the Russian, now it is Ukraine. But that is the history also of Ukraine now. And I think
Yeah, I agree.
it's just not, it's not the Soviet experience in general.
Yeah, I guess this is a question to all three of you, but I'm really interested in Jewish diaspora responses to the war in Ukraine. And specifically what I wanted to ask is how you think the war has changed Jewish identification, specifically Soviet Jewish identification with Ukraine. Individuals who once rejected the both Soviet and specifically Ukrainian experience as being one of anti-Semitism, and yet the outpouring of support for Ukrainian people from the Soviet Jewish diaspora has been insane, just in terms of financial and social support. And what do you think is the turning point there? How would you kind of characterize, part of it I'm sure has to do with this civic turn in Ukrainian culture, but I think it was almost lagging a little bit. So I guess this is a presentist question, but I wanted to see what you guys all thought.
I can take that. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's actually really fascinating. And I've been thinking about diaspora identity, Jewish Russian diaspora identification with Ukraine since 2014, when you started to see these Ukrainian Israeli videos coming out around the time of the Maidan. And you also saw Israelis going back and forth who maybe were originally from Ukraine, who were going back and helping with the sort of Maidan efforts. So this is something that sort of has grown up along the changing identification of Ukraine has helped to cause it and has also reacted to it. But what I find really interesting and deserves an entire book is the way that Jews of different generations who may have been born in the Soviet Union have kind of reconsidered what their cultural background is. And I see this from, people who are in their 20s to people who are in their 80s who say, well, I guess I'm Ukrainian, right? And maybe not even a Ukrainian Jew, right? This is someone who might have once said, I'm Russian, or I'm a Russian Jew, who's now saying, my Ukrainian background makes me do that. So it's a very interesting solidarity movement, which is this involves this kind of retroactive identification with a people that they might once not have dared to, think about identifying with. So I'm just going to echo your interest in the phenomenon.
I just want to kind of add, I'm sorry.
Oh, I was going to just
Sorry.
echo what Amelia said. And so much so that a family, I mean, this might be, you know, kind of an exceptional response. But because we do have, you know, many cases of Ukrainians or Ukrainian Jews who, you know, were Russian speakers and are Russian speakers who decide to shift the language at home, right? They don't know Ukrainian that well. Their children might know it better because, you know, from school, but they just decide to, you know, you know, that they resent so much Russia and the language they speak that they shift to Ukraine. They're trying to shift to Ukraine. But this kind of more exceptional case of a family in New York who, you know, they speak Russian at home. They have young children. I can't remember the age, but young. And they used to speak Russian to the children. They are of Ukrainian background, and they decided, you know, being in New York, so this about the diaspora, decide to, you know, learn Ukrainian and speak Ukrainian to their children, which is really impressive. Okay.
Yeah, sorry. I actually, you started to answer my question. I just wanted to raise the issue about Russian speaking, Ukrainian speaking. My understanding is that much of the Jewish community contemporarily in Ukraine would have identified like Zelensky as a Russian speaker, right? And I wonder how that fits into, you know, kind of the changes that are happening in Ukrainian identity. Like, have people decided, okay, I want to be a Ukrainian speaker now, I'm identifying more with Ukraine. Is this basically because of the war? Did the war really change people's view about Russia? Is this kind of an anti-Russia, split from Russia? You know, there's a lot going on there. But yeah, speaking about the linguistic aspect of all.
I mean, I'll jump in very quickly. I mean, I myself experienced the linguistic aspect when I was in Kiev in 2014. Kiev is largely a Russian, you know, Russian speaking. Regardless of Jews, non-Jews, it's primarily Russian speaking. And I experienced a great pushback. You know, I know Russian, now I'm studying Ukrainian, but I know Russian. And I you know, I would, I remember going into a pharmacy with my daughter and asking for a medication in Russian. And the, you know, the pharmacist, of course, he understood immediately that I'm a foreigner. He was very resentful towards me as almost as, you know, a Russian imperialist or an agent of Russian imperialism. And so I think that there is, you know, I hope that Ukraine will remain largely bilingual, but I think that there is this shift, you know, the civic turn, but I think, you know, that in terms of language, there might be this, you know, this push really for Ukrainian. And but yes.
Oh, did you want to say something? I have comments too, but go ahead.
Just a quick thing, just a little bit on that topic, but there, you know, I drink a lot of coffee, and in the time that I've been going to Ukraine, I spend a lot of time in coffee shops, and I noticed when coffee shops first started opening, independent private coffee shops first started opening in Ukraine, it seemed to me that every single one was named the Moskva, that it was very Russian oriented. And then slowly more and more Europa started popping up. And now it seems that every cafe is called the Europa or the Paris or whatever. That so you see a different orientation that I myself have observed away from Russia and towards Europe. It's not really addressing language, but I think there's a general shift in orientation that's happened over the last 15, 20 years.
I wanted to say something about language because it's, I mean, of course, there's this incredible irony that, you know, Putin purportedly was going into Ukraine to rescue the Russian people from, you know, the horrible Ukrainian Nazis who are making them forget their Russianness. And so part of the irony is that those are the people that are being bombed the most. It's Russian speakers. So Russian speaking Ukraine is getting the brunt of the aggression. But of course, the other irony is that everybody's switching, and this isn't just intellectuals. This is a lot of people who are just switching to Ukrainian with their family members sometimes. And so Zelensky, yes, he grew up Russian speaking in Eastern Ukraine in an industrial family born to Jewish parents. But, you know, he speaks Ukrainian now. Like he doesn't use, you never hear him using Russian unless he's very intentionally addressing a Russian audience. And I mean, he's a Russian comedian. Like you can go back and look at all of the stuff. So it's, I think the shift is in part in response to the attack on on the way that Ukrainian language has been encroaching on Russian, which is part of like, this is part of what the war is about, bizarrely.
I think this will be our penultimate question. I have a really quick one when you're done.
Also a very quick one for Amelia. Taras Shevchenko is so important to the Ukrainians, and I was really stunned by, never heard of David Hofstein doing these translations, because when I've read Taras Shevchenko, it's very easy to find, you know, essentially anti-Semitic content, or at least the way he looks at the Jews in the 19th century way. So how did Hofstein reconcile, or did he just selectively look? How did this work for, you know?
He didn't, as far as I know, he didn't translate Haidamaki, which is the really like the one that has this stuff about Cossacks who are sort of basically carrying out a pogrom. But he does translate some anti-Semitic stuff. He kind of caricatures it. He makes the, you know, he makes the Jews speak rather than a kind of funny sounding, you know, Russian-y Ukrainian. He makes them speak a Russian-y sounding Yiddish. But he and his colleagues were writing long introductions to these, talking about Taras Shevchenko being, you know, someone who was actually a good internationalist, and he once rescued a Jewish family from a fire. So, you know, they're whitewashing him to some extent. And Taras Shevchenko was a product of an anti-Semitic moment. I wouldn't call him the worst offender, but he certainly has anti-Semitic stereotypes. A lot of Ukrainian writers do. And Hofstein sort of doesn't worry about those. So part of what he's doing is certainly like aligned with what the country is doing in general, which is to say the Ukrainians need their bard. Let's take Shevchenko and clean him up. And he's helping with that project. But I think poetically, he finds so much in Shevchenko to love that he, you know, he wants to also draw that out. Yeah.
And my question, I think, is final. And what about Yiddish in Ukraine today? It ain't there, right?
I mean, from the people that, you know, we interviewed, you can see they're all quite elderly. A few of them, their grandchildren speak Yiddish, but just as not as a language they use on a day-to-day basis. So yes, I don't think Yiddish is going to be spoken again all that often in Ukraine in the future.
But Yiddish is being taught at Kyiv Mohilyanka. So of course, I mean, it won't be spoken. Yeah. And those who are learning Yiddish are mostly non-Jews, Ukrainians. The person who used to teach, who was an excellent teacher at Kyiv Mohilyanka, unfortunately left. So she's in Germany right now. She's remotely, but I don't think she's planning on going back. But anyway, you know, so it is being, there is, you know, it is being taught, but.
And why are the non-Jewish Ukrainians learning Yiddish? Some.
Yeah.
It's been a very important counterculture to, you know, to young Ukrainians, just as it has been to people everywhere, including in Israel and so forth. It's because it's a way of expressing an identity. Whereas I think for maybe young Israelis, it's like a Jewish identity that's different from the mainstream. I think for Ukrainians, you sometimes find Ukrainians that are like, this is part of Ukraine's history that's different from the mainstream. So you do see it in interesting ways. And it tends to be, you know, young, kind of hip, maybe slightly like politically active people. Also klezmer musicians, there's a klezmer revival, and people are claiming this as part of their own.
So who knew? Thank you so much for an amazing.